Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the podcast today. I am your host, Joel, and today we're plugging into a topic that's crucial for EV owners and enthusiasts alike, the different levels of EV charging. In this episode, Sebastian from the Kilowatt Station is joining us to help break down the three main types of electric vehicle charging: Level 1, Level 2, and Level 3. Whether you're an EV owner trying to understand your charging options or a seasoned driver curious about the latest advancements, we've got you covered. Sebastian, thank you for joining us on the podcast. How are you doing today?
I'm doing great. Happy to be here.
All right. Great. All right. So we're going to start with some of the specifics of level 1 charging. Next, we'll shift gears into level 2 charging, which is the more robust option that's becoming increasingly popular for home and public use. And finally, we'll dive into level 3 charging, also known as DC fast charging, which can supercharge your EV in record time and is key for long distance travel. So let's start with level 1 charging. So Sebastian, can you explain what level 1 charging is and how it kind of differs from all the other levels?
Yeah, so level 1 charging is your most basic form of EV charging. So level 1 charging will use an EVSE, which I'm going to say the term EVSE a lot in this. It's important to note, and this is kind of just, semantics, but for AC charging, your EV, the actual charger is in your car. All the little unit you plug into the wall is essentially just a smart extension cord. And so level 1 charging is using an EVSE that will plug into just any regular household outlet, typically.
And what's EVSE stand for?
Electric Vehicle Supply Equipment. Thank you.
There you go. There you go.
Anyway, so a level 1 EVSE will just plug into any standard, power outlet. In the US, it's your 3-prong NEMA 515 power outlet.
Gotcha. And that's very similar to like what you use for like anything else you plug into your home, correct?
Yeah, any other home appliance, toaster, phone charger, whatever.
Microwave, got it. All right, so with this level 1 charging, what are the typical charging speeds you will see, and kind of how does that impact EV owners' daily routines?
Yeah, so typically what you'll see, there are some EVs that don't follow the formula. For example, I believe Teslas will allow you to do a higher amperage even on 120 volt. But typically what you'll see is level 1 charging will cap out at about 1.4 kilowatts of power. It's 120 volts times 12 amps. And this is good for usually adding maybe 3 to 5 miles of range per hour in a typical EV. Just for an example, like I have a Chevy Bolt. If I was to try to plug in at empty and charge to full on level 1, it's looking at about 40 hours of charge time. Of course, it's important to note, most people aren't charging from empty to full whenever they plug their EV in. They're charging from 60% to 80%, or sometimes even shorter amounts of time. So it won't never be, 40 hours of charge for most people, but it's just, kind of a basic metric.
Gotcha. And what kind of equipment or infrastructure is required for level 1 charging?
Yeah, so really level 1 charging is the easiest, kind of most accessible charging to do at home. A lot of EVs include a level 1 EVSE. So they'll come with just a basic cable. And like I said, you just plug it into a normal household outlet. If you've got one at least close enough to the car that it'll reach, you can charge. And it's also good, if you don't end up using it, if you end up using maybe level 2 charging, which we'll talk about later, keep it in your trunk for if you're ever out and about, you end up staying at an Airbnb somewhere and you want to just plug in the garage or, anything like that.
So this is a question that kind of just popped in my mind too as well. And we hear this a lot. What is the pro or con, or you shouldn't do it, plugging an EV charge or EVSE into an extension cord? Is that something you should do or not? Is that frowned upon?
So generally speaking, you shouldn't do it. There are ways you can do it, especially, if you have a very, very beefy extension cord that's, a high gauge wire, and is made to, hold 12 amps over whatever distance your cord is. You, in theory, can do it, but generally speaking, it's just recommended not to. Most of these EVSEs, you're already talking 15, 20 feet long end to end. And when you start talking about, transferring power over such a long distance, you get into, potential for heat risk and then fire or voltage drop over the length of the cable, or just etc. So it's generally recommended just to not use one.
Also, another question kind of similar, because I've seen people ask this on forums, plugging it into like a surge protector. Do you need to do that or not?
No, generally not. Like I said, the actual charger lives in the vehicle, and your vehicle should have several protections built into it to keep, if anything was to go awry, it would just either stop charging or it'll, kind of adjust the power to make sure it stays in that safety zone. So generally speaking, it's safe to just plug a charger directly into the wall. A lot of people will actually end up having issues where if they plug in their level 1 EVSE into a GFCI outlet, it'll end up
Mhm.
tripping the GFCI just because of the way it ends up working. It's generally recommended, you don't necessarily need a GFCI circuit for EV charging.
That is true. I would say the way our house is built, my wife's level 1 charger is plugged in a GFCI, and I'd say probably twice a month it trips the breaker. So yeah,
Yeah.
so that can happen. So, all right, how accessible is level 1 charging for most EV owners, and is it sufficient enough for daily use?
Yeah, so I mean, level 1 charging is probably the most accessible form if you have the equipment. If your vehicle came with a charger, just because almost everyone has access to a power outlet somewhere, right? You don't
Mhm.
necessarily you don't need any fancy wiring per se or anything. If you can plug it into, in that 20 feet or so that the cable will reach, and you can just plug it into the wall, and then you're charging. And it's really, if you're only driving 30 miles or so a day, level 1 charging is honestly probably all you need if it's going to be plugged in, for 8-10 hours overnight. You're
Mhm.
looking at, adding 30 to 50 miles of range overnight. If you're only driving 30 miles, but you're perfect, you're golden.
Yeah, most people don't realize when you're charging an EV, there's 24 hours in a day. For about 12 of those, your electric vehicle will most likely may be plugged in. If you get home at 6 and plug it in and you leave at 6 the next morning, 12 hours a day, your electric vehicle could be plugged in and charging.
Right.
What are the pros and cons of level 1 charging as cost and convenience? I think we already talked about that, didn't we?
A little bit, but the
Yep.
biggest pro for level 1 charging is that the cost can be almost nothing if
Uh-huh.
especially if your EV included the EVSE, and then it can
Mhm.
be convenient if you drive short distances.
Mhm.
But the pros also kind of directly influence the cons of level 1 charging, of which, if your car didn't include a level 1 EVSE, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense for most people to then buy a level 1 EVSE when they could purchase maybe a level 2 EVSE. And then if you drive more than 30 miles a day, then, or, kind of whatever that, whatever you figure out, if my car is going to be plugged in for 10 hours, I can get 10 kilowatts of energy, 30 miles, 40 miles, whatever it is. If you drive more than that amount, it becomes less convenient.
Gotcha. And kind of our last question, kind of finish up level 1 charging. We hear this a lot. Anytime you talk about electricity, people think fire risk. So, are there any safety concerns or considerations with using a standard household outlet for EV charging?
Yeah, so really, the main concern comes down to just kind of, you just have to know what you're plugging into. Like in my Bolt, and I think a lot of EVs do it the same way. When you do level 1 charging, it defaults to 8 amp. So it won't actually use, most US homes, like your outlets are rated for 15 amp circuits. So you can
Hmm.
use 80% of that. So 12 amps on a outlet, or if it's a 15 amp breaker, 12 amps on that whole circuit. And so generally speaking, you don't want to charge your EV at that full 12 amps unless it's the only thing on that circuit, type deal. Otherwise, you
Hmm.
want to charge at 8 amps so that you still have, technically half the capacity of that, or a little less than half of the whole circuit available. And that's just kind of your home, right? If you don't have super modern
Hmm.
wiring, maybe it's not a good idea then to put a kind of constant load on that circuit. I kind of always compare it to, would you run a space heater on that outlet?
Yep. Hmm.
If you wouldn't, because every time I turn on a space heater, it trips a breaker, it turns off a microwave or whatever else. It means you probably shouldn't plug your EV in and have it charge at that full rate. You might want to back
Hmm.
it down to, a lower rate, which Teslas, I think, if I remember right, are excellent because you can actually kind of very,
They
very
do.
fine tune how many amps it draws. But a lot of EVs, like my Bolt, and I know a lot of do the same thing, where they're kind of just a preset 12 or 8. So
All right. Well, thank you. So that kind of wraps up level 1 charging. Next step, we'll hop into level 2 charging. So, what distinguishes level 2 charging from level 1 charging, and what improvements are you going to see with level 2 charging?
yeah, so level 2 charging is essentially just doubling the voltage of level 1 charging. So a level 1 charger runs on a standard household 120 volt outlet. Level 2 charging is done at 240 volt or 220, 208, depending on if it's a commercial commercial 3-phase electrical install, whatever. But we'll say 240 volt because that's what most people have in their homes. And so essentially that's all it is. So 240 volts kind of what you would use for like a dryer or an oven, electric hot water heater, stuff that you already have in your house. It's just kind of, you use it, for EV charging instead.
And speed. So how does level 2 charging speed compare to level 1? And what are the typical charging times for kind of different EV models out there on level 2 charging?
Yeah, so you can typically expect level 2 charging to be at least twice as fast as level 1, just because of that double voltage. If you're doing 120 volt at 12 amps, you're doing 1.4 kilowatt. Well, since kilowatt, watts is just volt times amps. If you're doing 240 times 12, now you're doing 2.8, 2.8 kilowatt, just on the same kind of 12 amp circuit, just doubling the voltage. So you typically see 2 times the speed of level 1 charging, but depending on your EV, it could be up to 15 times faster than level 1 charging. We're starting to see EVs on the market now that can do level 2 charging at 19.2 kilowatt, which is, now of course you're talking, that's an 80 amp circuit. That's, pretty high. A lot of people can't have that in their home, which we'll talk about later. But generally speaking, I mentioned earlier, my Bolt would take 40 hours to go from empty to completely full on a level 1 charger. But my same Bolt, because of its onboard charger that's built in, can do 48 amp. It will do empty to full in under 10 hours on a level 2 charger that's at that 48 amp capacity.
Gotcha. So you kind of talked about with level 1 charging is kind of just plug and play. You buy the charger or buy the EVSE and you plug it in, you're ready to go. What kind of installation and equipment is required for level 2 home charging? Because it does get a little more advanced.
Yeah, so most people, when they do level 2 charging, they do end up having to have some sort of installation completed, because most people don't just have a spare 240 volt outlet just laying around in their garage or wherever they park their car. And so that's when you start getting into, do you want your charger to be hardwired? Do you want it to have a plug-in? So many of the plug-in units will use a NEMA, what's called a NEMA 1450 outlet. So that's what you're commonly going to find on modern clothes dryers, ovens, water heaters, these kind of big appliances. So you can choose to install one of those in your garage, or you could choose to just go ahead and just do a hardwire unit. And so that's where you'll see it. Also, a lot of EVs do come with level 2 chargers instead of a level 1 charger, although we're starting to see that kind of phase out. Tesla doesn't include a wall connector or a mobile connector with their vehicles anymore, like Rivian doesn't. And, some of these other companies aren't including the kind of mobile cords anymore. And so, level 2 charge, a lot of people are actually purchasing their level 2 chargers.
And with this installation, is there any special considerations you have to kind of take into effect for a home or business wanting to install these?
Yeah, so level 2 charging, because it runs at such a higher amperage, you're talking maybe 48 amp, 80, or, if you have the space and you have the money, do the full 80 amp charging if your vehicle supports it. You end up talking about, you're doing a lot higher gauge wiring, so you're doing a lot thicker copper wiring. And when you start, factoring that in, it gets more expensive, for shorter distances. And then if you want to do a long distance, you're going to be shelling out, right? And so that's why you'll see a lot of times in public, these level 2 chargers are close to the front of stores, because that was as far away as they could put it, from their electrical panel, and it be in a parking spot, but not so far away they're then having to shell out, buku bucks for, that copper wire just to maybe make it a little further back in the lot.
Gotcha. And that kind of leads to our next question, kind of the cost. How does the cost of level 2 compare to the cost of level 1 for installation?
Yeah, so that really, it just depends again on your home. Some people's homes, maybe they only have 100 amp service to their house. They might have to look into doing a service upgrade on their home to actually support, if they want to charge at 32 amp, 48 amp. But it's also important to note, level 2 charging, there's a lot of flexibility depending on how much you drive. For example, I charge at home with level 2, but I only have a 16 amp level 2 EVSE. Because I didn't, for how much I drive, I didn't need anything more powerful than that. I still get the benefit of it's twice as fast, or, a little more than twice as fast as a level 1 charger, but I didn't have to do any of these service upgrades or whatever. So really, that just depends on your needs. And then the other thing that can kind of drive the cost of level 2 charging up is where is your home breaker panel, right? If your home breaker panel is not super close to where you park your car, then you're going to have to pay for, all that wiring, that extra length of wiring to get the outlet or the hardwire unit installed close to where your vehicle parks.
So yeah, I mean, that was the major cost for me because, it was probably a 60-foot run from the one side of my house to my garage. Other people's have them in their garage or just right outside the garage. And you'd be surprised just how much, if you're, talking, $10, $15 a foot, times, 60 feet, that's where you kind of get your cost at.
Yeah.
And
for me,
kind
I
of
was
in
lucky.
Yep.
For me,
Yeah,
I was
yes.
lucky. I was able to put my level 2 outlet, 6 feet from my breaker panel. So it was
Yes.
nothing.
And that cost. And we always suggest when you get to this point of charging, you probably this is where you want to probably get an electrician or someone certified out that knows this, because like Sebastian said, you're dealing with special wires, you're dealing with some things that need to be torqued a certain way. It's always good at this point to get a licensed electrician out to see what you have and to install this for you.
For sure.
All right, so kind of looking at the whole broader spectrum of the EV ecosystem and EV charging, what role does level 2 charging play in this?
So level 2 charging is kind of the current end game for home charging and for a lot of, kind of public charging. If you're installing public charging somewhere where people dwell a long time, thinking restaurants, workplaces, hotels, parking garages, level 2 charging makes sense, because if your car's going to be sitting there for a long time, then, maybe you don't do a level 3 charger because it'll charge too fast, and then you end up having a car just sitting there taking up a spot. But, level 1 charging is just too slow. And so that's kind of, it offers the most flexibility for drivers, at home, who maybe want to be able to plug in, know that they can do a long drive at home or long drive in the day, get home, plug in, know the next morning, they're going to have plenty of juice to go and do whatever they want to do the next day. And so for, to me, that helps kind of alleviate the whole range anxiety issue. And then, like, for example, where I work, I have level 2 charging available. So I basically don't charge at home now, which is kind of awesome. And I get to work, my battery's at whatever percent. I leave, my battery's full. It's perfect. But if it was faster charging, I would be trying to, it's been 30 minutes, I need to go move my car type situation. Or if it was level 1 charging, it wouldn't be full when I left.
Yeah. And I think that's what people don't understand is, everyone is pounding the pavement. We need more fast chargers. We need more fast chargers than we do for traveling, but we also need a whole lot more level 2, destination chargers out there. So if you're going to the mall, you're going to the movies, it would be great if you're going to watch a 2.5 hour movie, you can play your car in for 2.5 hours and get a lot of that range back. And I think that's where when we see that start happening is we'll see probably the broader acceptance of electric vehicle adoption.
For sure. And there are definitely businesses out there that have, figured that out, like, for example, the IKEA in Memphis having EV chargers. IKEA is one of those places you're going to be there several hours when you go, because you're going to walk through the entire showroom of the store. And then, you go through the food center, and then you go through the little grab and go at the end. Like, you're going to be there a long time. So it makes perfect sense if you can plug in there and then you come back out, and you've gained 30, 40%, just for, and generally speaking, level 2 charging is typically cheaper than level 3 charging, like at a public sector. So
yeah, I believe when we were out doing our video, we were seeing rates like 15, 20 cents a kilowatt hour as compared to, 35 cents a kilowatt hour of fast chargers. Yep. So yeah. All right. So last one, level 3 DC fast charging, the beast of charging. So what makes level 3 charging, the DC fast charging, distinct from level 1 and level 2?
Yeah, so level 3 charging, DC fast charging, so it utilizes actually DC power. So it takes in usually 3-phase, 480 volt grid connection, converts it into DC power, and then is able to send that straight into your car's battery pack. So it does this, it bypasses that onboard charger we talked about earlier, because that onboard charger's job is only to take your AC home power and convert it into DC for your battery. So that these high voltage DC power supplies are able to just send it straight to the battery. That's how they achieve, such high speed charging.
And how quickly can level 3 chargers typically recharge an EV, and how does this speed impact kind of long distance driving?
Yeah, so this really just kind of depends on your EV, but there are some EVs on the market that can go empty to full in 30, 45 minutes. There's some EVs on the market that maybe, take longer than that. But I think it's, what does Kia claim or Hyundai claim for the EGMP cars? Usually it's 20 minutes from 10 to 80 or 20 to 80?
I think they say 18. If you want to get technical, I think they say 18 minutes from
I was
10
just
to 80,
20 minutes. We'll give them some time for handshake and everything.
That's right. which I have an IKEA EV6, and I'm gonna let you know that speed is right. It's like 18, 19 minutes for 20 minutes from that 10 or 12% to 80%. So Kia, you got that. Kia Hyundai, you got that right.
Right. But yeah, so that significantly impacts your long range travel, because if you feel like you can actually stop and then get on the road again in the time it takes to go in, get some snacks, use the bathroom, whatever, then you get back out of the car, it's at whatever percent you need it to be, and you just leave and you go to the next one. So
yeah, and kind of with the with the no government initiatives out to kind of push these fast chargers, what are the technical requirements and infrastructure needed to kind of support level 3 charging stations?
yeah, so I kind of mentioned earlier. So the big kind of kick for level 3 charging is it typically requires a 3-phase 480-volt infrastructure to kind of feed the power into the units. And you typically will only find 3-phase 480-volt in your commercial environments, your super centers, your gas stations, stuff like that. You're not going to typically find it at your home or even a lot of like apartment complexes or anything. And because of that, it's that kind of limits where it's typically installed. Not saying people don't install them other places. I think Missouri has some that are installed at like some state parks or whatever. It can be done, but when you're talking about actually building out that full infrastructure to get 480 volt to wherever you're at, it gets way more expensive compared to, oh well, it's already here at Walmart. Walmart already has the 3-phase power. How do we add on to add the EV charging? And the other issue with it kind of is not issue, but technical requirement is it's also very high amp. It needs a lot of amps to feed the charger and then charge your vehicle at 50, 100, 150 kilowatts of power. And so that typically then requires a big transformer to be installed at the site, which can either be an upgrade to one that's already there. So a lot of people or a lot of installs will actually have their own transformer specifically for the EV chargers.
And so what are the limitations or challenges that are kind of associated with DC fast charging, such as availability or cost?
Yeah, so we're kind of in a weird period of EV adoption where availability and then cost of EV charging is very dependent on where you live. For example, where we are in Arkansas, we don't have that many DC fast charge stations, but also the ones we have aren't usually fully utilized.
That is true.
So do we need more stations? I think yes, because at some point, the adoption will grow and it would be better to have them and not need them than need them and not have them. But at the same time, it's an expensive business to get into. Can you justify installing the units if they're not being used? And then, have other places in the US, like a lot of urban areas where you end up having large lines to use EV charging, or there's, not enough stations or, anything like that, to where then it's like maybe they need more stations to, offset their higher EV adoption in that area. And so it's kind of a struggle. We're just in that kind of weird in between. We look at East Coast, West Coast, there's chargers everywhere, it seems like. And then you compare that to kind of the middle of the map where it's every 60, 70, 80 miles along your major interstate highways, and that's it. And then because of all this, cost can be a struggle, because we've kind of seen over the last few years, DC fast charging costs have steadily grown. And this is another tough one to solve because, like I mentioned, it's very expensive to install these DC fast chargers and you have to make your money up somewhere. And so I understand why station operators are kind of bumping these costs up. I think I've seen EVgo, Pilot, Flying J, which I believe the pricing is set by Pilot, Flying J. EVgo just kind of hosts them on their network. But those stations usually run around 70 cents a kilowatt hour. I think Electrify America non-pass plus membership now is like 56 cents. And this is coming from like a year and a half ago. Electrify America was at like 35 cents a kilowatt hour. And so it's a definite growth. And, these businesses have to make money, because if they don't make money, then they don't expand and they go away. But at the same time, at what point do the charging costs get too high to where then people would just look and go, I can just go buy a gallon of gas for that, So
yeah, that is true. That's where I think we may get to a point, and we hope not, to where, charging an electric vehicle is about the same as filling up your gas car. We hope we don't get that, hopefully.
If you can do most of your charging at home, the cost will always win. Where we are, or at least where I am, I pay like 11 cents a kilowatt hour for electricity at home. It would cost me $6 to charge my car from empty to full, which I don't do every day. I charge it like 5, 10, 15% every day. So it costs me 50 cents per day to drive to work and back, compared to a gas car where it would be at least $3 or $4. And so if you can do most of your charging at home, it will pretty much always be a more cost effective to do versus driving a gas car. But when you start driving in, if you can't charge at home and you're doing a lot of DC fast charging, or when you start looking at like road tripping and stuff, it's at some point we're going to kind of reach that price parity to where it would cost the same or sometimes maybe less to drive a gas car that got 30 miles to the gallon.
That is true. That is true. Okay, we'll finish with our big question of the day, because this is kind of, people see level 3 charging and EV adoption kind of like one big arena. How does the deployment of level 3 charging stations kind of affect the overall adoption of electric vehicles?
Yeah, so I think as DC fast charging becomes more ubiquitous, I think adoption will probably grow at a faster rate. One of the biggest challenges for EV driving, in my opinion, is when you're looking around, you're out in public, there's like maybe one EV charger for every 15 gas stations, or at least where we live in the kind of, in Arkansas, in the middle kind of part of the country. When you want to go somewhere in a gas car, you don't think about it, right? You just get in and go. No matter whenever that gas light comes on, you know that you have a gas station close by. It's not a concern. But we're still at that point with EV charging where you kind of have to do some pre-planning, to know that, oh, I'm going up to Fayetteville. Okay, I'm probably going to want to charge in Clarksville, so I have enough juice to get up the mountains and get up there. And so I kind of think we need to get to the point where maybe you don't have to think as hard about road tripping, going longer distances. And then once we get to that point, I think more people will be fine to actually get into EVs, because they won't have that range anxiety, that kind of charging anxiety of, well, am I going to actually make it there? Can I take it? Or is it going to be too much of a pain in the butt and I'll just take the other car?
Yes, I couldn't agree more. So this information has been awesome and so beneficial. Huge shout out to Sebastian for helping us understand the different levels of EV charging today. Hopefully, if you're watching, you have a better understanding of how EV charging works and what options are available for your driving needs. A reminder, you can follow Sebastian on X and on YouTube by searching at Kilowatt Station. You can find us, the EV Geek Podcast, on X by searching the EV Geek. Thank you all again for joining us, and we will see you on our next episode. So long, everyone.
See ya.